Okay, can everybody see the shared screen okay? Great, thumbs up on that. Welcome everybody. It's been just over a month since we called from KubeCon, and so delighted to have our next community call. We've got quite a long agenda today, so we're going to quickly start moving through things. We've got some project updates, release updates, updates from QCon and KubeCon, a number of community updates, and I'm glad that a number of folks from the community are joining today to actually talk about their updates. Trying a couple of new things, Q by example, which we'll come to later on. Delighted that Joel and Sam from Dagger are joining to talk about Dagger and how their use of Q. Finally, we're going to another experimental thing with a bit of a brain teaser at the end, and then some detail on future calls and upcoming calls. So let's get started. Marcel, I'll hand over to you for a quick project update.
Yes, so as you might have noticed a bit, we're in a bit of an informal freeze to finish up the 0.5 release. So that means there are actually, we are working on other features in the meantime, but they're not being submitted, just because we want to make sure that 0.5 is the self-contained thing. So let me focus on 0.5 first. So basically, this is a almost complete rewrite of comprehensions and God, what was the other thing?
Cycle
detection. Yeah, there you go. Comprehension and cycle detection. Yeah, so that's both algorithms are now considerably simpler. And we've noticed that if there's bugs related to this, which of course, if you re-implement something, you'll get some bugs. Like fixing this rather than taking sometimes weeks is a matter of hours often for many of those bugs. Not all of them, but it's considerably easier to understand. It also moves it a lot towards being concurrent, so thread safe, so that you can have the same value basically operate on the multiple threads. Not quite there yet, but getting very close. So what we also want to do is we have some deprecated language features, namely the double colon for definitions, block comments. Believe it or not, Q used to have block comments, and some other things that were deprecated and not unsupported already for a very long time. But they were actually still supported, and in the API there was this bug that they were actually still supported. So I saw some examples coming by where people had like a colon, and it still worked, which is not okay. So we're going to turn these off in the API, which might break some people. But then in 0.6, we're going to permanently remove it. For now, it's just being turned off in the API, which means that you can still programmatically re-enable it if you really have to, but beware that sooner or later these things will be gone. They're just in the way. They're making debugging, or new development harder. So it's just easier to get rid of it. Yeah, so please test these 0.5 as they're coming out aggressively. It's getting very close to a final release, but there's still some things to be done. Next slide.
Yeah, just a quick note, a huge thanks to those who have tested 0.5.0. We've had a number of issues been reported, and that is a massive help. Those people have also added code to Unity as well, which means that we can help prevent issues in future as well. We catch them earlier when the CL lands, as opposed to actually when we do a release. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to give an idea what's in 0.6.0, so there are several CLs ready to go. One of them does a more incremental computation for ToolsFlow, which could significantly improve its performance. There's another thing related to ToolsFlow also, which is if you have a chain of references, which ToolsFlow often has, then there's actually some quadratic behavior, which is eliminated. It's now then linear in 99% of the cases. So that should be could help a lot of people that see performance issues with ToolsFlow. So that's all almost ready to go. Then required fields, the proposal that's out there is very close to being fully implemented. So this also opens up some possibilities to optimizations. And also optimizations related to disjunctions, and also actually bug fixes related to disjunctions. So that's sort of the focus for 0.6. We're thinking about possibly doing structure sharing, throwing that in there as well. It should be not so complicated anymore to do. So that might be another big performance improvement. I'm not saying we're going to get to all the performance improvements that we know we can get, but hopefully it will be, especially the disjunctions, which will still be some time. So you'll see a lot of these things getting in, but disjunction will take a little bit longer. And that will be by far the biggest performance improvement, I would think. So for the rest, I'm adding some features to support the language guide, strangely enough. So the language guide is written with sort of this new queue in mind, right? Like with we sort of looked at all the features are more coherent, and that queue becomes simpler to explain. So the required field is a big yes, Joel, I know you do. Hope you can test it soon. So the required field is a big one there, and the other one is open lists. Just as structs are open by default, lists would be open by default. So that would be it's not a very big change, but it makes things much nicer. So yeah, what we're trying to do is, even if we have a beta 2 launched, or the final beta, even before the final 0.5 is out, we probably will start submitting some of the performance things for 0.6, and then basically release 0.5. If there's any changes that still need to go in, add those to a release branch, rather than like postponing some of the performance enhancements further. So I've taken up quite a lot of time, so I'll hand it back.
That's all good. I think the only other thing to add to that is what we'll do with 0.6 is try to get a release out as soon as possible, an alpha release, so that folks don't have to actually test against TIP, which is just slightly more awkward than actually testing against a proper release. It will be a very early alpha, but we're going to try and compress the release cycle this time, just so that it's not as long as it was between 0.4.3 and what will be 0.5 when it finally goes out. So we're trying to shorten that by getting as much exposure to things as possible, particularly with there being some fairly invasive changes in 0.6 as well. We talked about the proposals last time. So 1937, that's the Go release support policy, has been implemented. We're now just supporting the latest version, 2 versions of Go, as far as the Q project is concerned. And Marcel talked about the required fields proposal. That's going to be part of 0.6.0. Moving on to individual updates. Rog, do you want to talk to us about the module side of things?
Sure. Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of people about the design of the modules stuff. There's I mean, obviously Q has Go influences, and the imports look just the same as Go rather, but actually it's quite a different language, and the same design decisions don't necessarily apply. So yeah, we're looking to take some stuff from Q, probably from Go. I keep on confusing the two. But also looking to potentially simplify, because I think there are some aspects of Go which are more complex than perhaps they need to be, and certainly for an initial implementation, I think simplicity wins. And one big question actually is, if we go for modules, one big question is, what does compatibility look like for Q? Like if we're talking about schema only Q, the answer's probably quite relatively straightforward. But when we're talking about templates, and this influences very much about whether if you have some sort of deduplication where 2 people require different versions and you choose the latest of them, then compatibility is really important, and having some rules for compatibility so that people can have some assurance or some reasonable confidence that upgrading their Q modules versions won't actually break everything. So that's also something I've been thinking about quite a lot, and we've got some potentially interesting ideas in that area. So that's me for now.
Cool, great. And so the next steps on that are actually, we're working towards a design doc that we're going to be sharing with folks, right?
Yeah, sort of
Perfect.
V2 of the modules proposal. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
V3 actually.
Oh,
gosh.
V3. Yeah, this is true. Yeah, V2 wasn't made public, I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay. Aram, Wasm.
Yeah, so me and Roger, we did a lot of design discussions and thinking about function signature in general, because function signatures are a prerequisite for WebAssembly. So we did a lot of work on that, and because they're quite different from other languages, and I won't go into this at this point, but there are quite some deep questions to answer about those. So we did that, and also been thinking about how to represent what we're trying to design in Q's denotational semantics. And again, we thought about how ABI problems, like how would you use it from different languages, how different languages could interact with Q through WASM. And on the implementation side, I am actually implementing right now the let's call it pre-proposal of function signatures, so I can tie it up with the WebAssembly stuff that I've been doing. So we can expect a proof of concept for the community at the end of this year. So that's on the WebAssembly front. But also, can someone please move to the next slide? Yeah, I also did a talk on Q at the local Vienna Gopher meetup. And there's a YouTube recording available, and also the slides are available. It's basically I went into I did a historical walkthrough into like the evolution of languages in general, and how the programming languages evolve versus configurations, and why do we actually need a configuration language. And then I did essentially try to answer the question of what is Q by doing a Q walkthrough, or like a tutorial, or something like maybe something that could become eventually like the Q tour. And I very briefly touched upon how can Qs currently can solve people's practical problems. So if you're interested in any of that, there's a recording available. And that's it for me.
Great, thanks. We'll share the slides after the call as well. Daniel, on on Unity side of things.
Cool. So when it comes to Unity, as a quick refresher, the reason private Unity is different is that current Unity, when we test with third-party projects, all of those projects are open source. So we just directly use them, like any person can download the source code. So when it comes to private source code, the design is to have a GitHub app that allows us to synchronize and receive that code as long as it's been authorized to do so. So that app exists now. It responds to, as a GitHub app, it responds to push events on GitHub. So when the third party updates the code, we can get notified and update or synchronize our copy. And the copies are private and use obfuscated names for the sake of, if in a case the links get leaked or anything like that, we're not potentially leaking the names of who's integrated. So what I'm working on now is mainly testing because this whole flow, I'm testing it manually currently, but I want to have a full end-to-end test to test that the main flow with GitHub and all of its steps work correctly. We want to also be able to configure, well, for the third party to configure what files get copied when we sync. Currently, all files get synced, but that's often not necessary to test, for example, Q files or Go tests that use Q APIs. And we also want to retain some details of the original Git history, such as, for example, the original commit hashes. Because that might be interesting to tell, was this third-party repo broken with this Q version at this particular upstream commit, which is currently not possible. And that is it for now. Yeah.
Cool. Just a reminder, thanks to those folks who have already submitted code that will be entered into private Unity. As Daniel's working on private Unity, we're just doing things manually on the side for now. But even those submissions that folks have sent over has been hugely helpful for 0.5.0. That's helped to flush out a number of bugs, so it's much appreciated. Carmen, on the docs and content side of things.
Hi, Al. We are currently trying to put a lot of things together to get out an initial beta.qling.org for people to see. And for those of you who have attended the previous docs and content calls, those 4 things roughly fall into the 4 buckets of substance, structure, workflows, and governance. For now, I have reached out to some of you, and I really thank you for any input that you're giving. If you want to continue to give input, There's two primary places where you could, with various, I guess, maturity cycles for now, and we will update when that changes. But one is the meta discussion. It's issue 1995, where you can continue to put your wish lists. And if you need a place to ideate or soundboard, or maybe the idea is too rough and early and ugly that you don't want to put it down in a discussion, but rather would like to see if it's worth exploring, we made a docs and content in Slack for more ephemeral soundboarding before that happens. In addition to the beta work that we're trying to get out, if you are interested in partnering, if you are an open source project that would like to share your story and how Q has helped you solve a particular problem and would like that out as a case study, or you would like your logo, your project or your company logo on the new Q site, or maybe you have your own content that maybe a blog post that we can link out to, anything that you have that you would like, we ask that you email documentation@q.works. And that's it for docs for now.
Great, thank you. Dominic, on Project Ops. You just have to unmute first, Dominic.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Short update from Project Ops. So one thing is user feedback and user research, which sounds very scientific, but it's basically like a lot of people are looking at this from very different angles, and we're trying to collect the feedback and really try to understand common themes, which will then inform maybe priorities or focus for the next steps, like what Carmen just said for the beta is one example there. We're really like listening to the feedback we're getting. Speaking of beta.qlang.org, there is some complexity involved in there. Logos is a good example. I recently learned you can't just put like a logo online. You need a certain form. It needs to be legally sound. So that's something I work on. So basically, this is the general topic of my daily work. There's lots of general admin and things that are not really foreseen, but still have to be dealt with and solved. So, yeah, and the last point is we're doing an event all together. I mean, we're a good example of a remote first culture, and we work together mainly online, but it's still sometimes cool to sit together over lunch or coffee to really discuss problems in depth. And we're doing this before Christmas, so looking forward to this, and I'm organizing this. So
great,
that was it from my side.
Thank you very much. My update on the LSP side of things, the work on the LSP has been delayed by the version 0.5.0 unblocking work we've been doing. As talked about before, though, we will use GoPlease and the Dagger QLSP as a starting point for that implementation, with a focus on VS Code as the first editor. Also with quite a focus on integration test in order to make it possible and easily and scalable for other folks to contribute to that effort as well. So 0.5.0 has just taken a considerable amount of time longer than we thought, but we are getting close. As we say, it's just a couple of days away now. It seems to be the eternal thing we're saying. But we have, I think, Marcel skipped over the detail. There now are only 2 issues in the 0.5.0 milestone. So I feel slightly more confident in saying that now. Moving on to quick updates. We were at QCon and KubeCon. I'll be careful how I pronounce those. Carmen, do you want to talk to us about QCon?
Sure. Last month in San Francisco, Marcel gave the opening keynote for a track called Languages of Infrastructure Beyond YAML. The link that is up there is a link to a future talk next Tuesday that will happen at 1700 UTC if you are interested in registering and watching it online. Next slide. Here is our friend Justin Cormack, the CTO of Docker, who was sitting front and center and giving some nice preview about some of the things that Marcel talked about. Some of the things here include the idea of configuration engineering and that still being in its infancy, and then just all the places where configuration is and the concept or the thought of infrastructure as data. Next slide.
Carmen, Justin also gave a talk on that same track, didn't he?
He did. So there were 3 other tracks in that, in the track. I was the track host. It was a talk about policy, just general history and policy, what the policy landscape is looking like right now, in which Justin gave a talk on. There was also a talk by Joe Duffy, who's the CEO of Pulumi, and he's coined the term infrastructure as code. And there was another talk about eBPF for observability and how that can be used in certain things beyond kernel mods. So all in all, a really good track to try to understand the new emergent trends in things where YAML has fallen short of its expressiveness.
Great.
Speaking of that, for those of you unfamiliar with KubeCon, they, as an organization, come out with this trends report that they publish, and I think quarterly. And note in the blue box, we are considered QLang and infrastructure unification and scalable configuration management. KubeCon organizers reach out to tech leads of various different companies, large sizes, small sizes, all different industry verticals, and they try to keep their ear to the ground of what's emergent, what's going to be the new big thing. And it's really exciting to see that Q is there, as well as some of the more nascent things that us as an industry are trying to solve, which are the scalable configuration management and infrastructure unification. And I think that we have one more slide. Yes, so if you're interested in hearing Marcel's talk on KubeCon+, I have a link there. It will be given on the 6th of December, next Tuesday, 1700 UTC. And it will be made, the talk will be made available on YouTube sometime after the conclusion of KubeCon+, but they haven't given me an exact date. We will make sure to announce that via our Twitter handle, and as well as our Announce Issue 2022. And that's
Great.
it. KubeCon.
Thank you. We also, Carmen and I then visited KubeCon. We met a number of folks at KubeCon. Very pleased that some of them are joining us today. This was really an opportunity for us to go around and speak to folks about what it is they're trying to do, either in the configuration, API, data space, and understand the problems that they're facing. And use that as an opportunity to understand, okay, where does Q fit into that landscape? So we're really hopping between all the booths that existed that were there at the conference, and these are just some of the logos of the folks that we stopped by to see. Had some various very different conversations, from ChainGuard down on the bottom left there, talking about the policy side of things, to Grafana in terms of how actually Sam Boyer is looking to try and define a new way in which APIs can be declared in a more scalable way at Grafana. Trying to think of another good example here. Kong, just talking to them about how actually they declaratively use, they've got an internal language that they use for declaring APIs. So really just trying to learn a lot from these folks about either how they're using Q, because there are a lot of folks using Q. That was interesting to see. But a number of folks, we got to learn from what they're trying to do, what problems they're trying to solve, and where Q fits into that landscape. So really a number of very interesting conversations. Thank you to those folks who we did speak to for being patient. We have been working on 0.5.0, so we will be getting in touch to follow up on those conversations that we had at KubeCon. So now flipping to some related points, community updates. The first, I don't know whether Michael was, I think I saw him on the call earlier on. Michael, if you wanted to sort of talk about your blog post series here, you'd be very welcome to. I don't know whether you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, please, go ahead.
What should I say? So basically, we've met with some of you, I think in August, and this is when we discussed some of the ideas that I had and some of the experiences that I had in the past over the course of last year with Q. And my goal was to try and document it as in a complete format as it was possible, so that A, I don't forget, and B, it fills that vacuum that exists around like Q use cases and kind of real world examples of how to use Q, because I find that even now a lot of people misinterpret Q. Even after going through initial documentation on your website, they think it's just another kind of serialization language, like similar to JSON or YAML, and because it's not always obvious. This is why kind of I try to show Q from many different angles to see to show not only how do you work with data, but also how do you do Q scripting and automate end-to-end and interact with external systems. So yeah, I think there's not much for it to add. I mean, feel free to go and read it. If you have any critique, please forward it to me, because I'd rather have this accurate and up to date than do something wrong and say something wrong.
They were excellent blog posts. They really were, and that you actually received quite a bit of feedback on Twitter as well, and via LinkedIn as well, I think, didn't you?
There's quite a lot of interest. It's always very difficult to gauge how much of it is kind of genuine interest, or I'm going to go and try it, versus, oh, this is just something new and shiny, I'll put a like on it. And sadly, I don't see Q kind of in the discipline where I'm working, right? The network automation. I don't see Q kind of completely displacing or even overtaking Ansible, or even getting anywhere close to Ansible, because it's still by far the most dominant. And because it's so simple to understand, a lot of people were just drawn to that, and they will never kind of want to see or look at anything else. But there are a group of people who are kind of open to new ideas and want to do things better. And sadly, those are the minority, and those are usually the kind of advanced users who are not always kind of tweeting or posting about the work that they do. So they kind of go away, do this internally, and then you may hear from them, I don't know, a year later down the track when they open an issue or something. So so mainly it's for that people, like for group of people that's kind of advanced enough, they understand the value of static typing and schema validation, and not afraid to kind of venture into this kind of uncharted territory, which is kind of Q use cases around network automation these days.
Cool. Well, Bill Kennedy seemed to like the blog post as well, because he tweeted about it, saying that it was one of the best explainers he'd seen. So that was some good praise from Bill.
I don't know who he is, but he appears to be like a very important person, right?
he's a well-known person. Bill's a very well-known trainer in the Go world.
Oh, okay.
So that's high praise from Bill there. Awesome.
Cool.
That's fantastic. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Yeah, no worries.
We also had a nice post from Jacob at CloudPlane. This is a nice comparison of why they chose Q over Dahl, JSONet, even Go itself as a language, and Helm, and how they landed on that choice. This Twitter thread from Satnam didn't actually mention Q at all, but it's a really good read, this Twitter thread, that effectively provides the motivation for why Q needs to exist. And this last sentence here I loved particularly. Configuration languages as a second or third class citizen, scribbled in YAML and JSON with uncertain meaning. I just thought that was a really nice motivation for why Q needs to exist, and effectively the opportunity there is with Q, the tooling and the APIs that we have. So mention from the ChainGuard folks as well, they using Q as their policy language within Sigstore, so announcing more policies that are available to folks to consume within the Sigstore world. Carmen at NTT gave a nice presentation.
Yes. So this was a presentation about, I think it was the networking. My Japanese is very rusty, but it was for the ONIC, and it was a lecture on creating a new cloud native network controller. When I asked for a translation or an English version, they announced that they will be giving an English version of this presentation next week for the Open Source Summit in Japan. So if you are in Japan, if you want to see that talk, they will also make that available afterwards.
Great, thank you. Kubevela announced that they released V1.6, so congratulations to Fogon team and getting that out the door. Very pleased that we'd managed to move you off 0.2.2 to the latest version of Q to make that happen. So that was some positive news. This is just a mention of a talk that Dimitri and Rupa gave at KubeCon, or GitOpsCon, which was sort of like a sub-conference as part of KubeCon. This was a really nice talk, actually, a really good introduction to Q itself and a motivation as to how Q can be used as an alternative to YTT. So I enjoyed this talk a lot. I was there in person and then chatted to Rupa and Dimitri afterwards. So it really encourage you to watch that, or there's the blog post that Dimitri followed up with afterwards as well. Chris James sent out what I thought was quite a fun tweet. Chris, I know from the Go meetup in London, and now Chris is claiming that he thinks he's a DevOps engineer, having discovered Q and having enjoyed playing around with it quite a bit. So I thought that was a fun tweet to share. Caddy has now got an adapter for Q, so that's an alternative way of configuring Caddy. So as Matt Holt explained in response, this is really for folks who want to be able to drive Caddy and use their have their Caddy configuration be part of a wider Q configuration. So really taking advantage of Q's composition and validation benefits there, as opposed to it just being like a silo of Caddy configuration. And Elton also published a nice blog post that is an introduction to Q as well. Our friends at Grey Matter have got a webinar coming up next month where they're talking about QLang and the now famous complexity clock, and how Grey Matter is leveraging Q as well. So there's, if you link through to that tweet there, there's the opportunity to sign up for the webinar as well. So this is just a call for, if there's things that you're working on, perhaps something interesting in Q, or perhaps you're curious in trying Q for something, please tweet and include at Q_lang. Then we will retweet that with the community hashtag and include a sort of summary in the next community call as well. On Slack, a huge uptick in activity this month. Big thank you to anyone who's actually contributed by either asking questions or answering them. Kevin Henderson's had a very busy month. Kevin has raised a huge number of feature requests and has sent a significant number of Slack messages as well. Really, really positive stuff there. That's Kevin's really stretching the bounds of Q in terms of thinking about, okay, what should we be doing on the documentation side of things? I'm trying to pull a couple of examples here, thinking about how Q can perhaps interact with Excel as a different format, to thinking about the details of how Q can be improved from like an error handling perspective. So really covering a hugely broad range of things. So Kevin, a big thank you for all the feedback you've provided there. Tony Worm and Scott Lewis Kelly are two names that we've also seen a lot of answering within Slack and GitHub discussions. So thank you very much for helping out in making the Q community a welcoming place. A link there just to join Slack. One of the things we're trying out this month, very briefly, is like a Q by example thing. So one of the bugs that has been discovered as part of the 0.5.0 work is around how to create defaults for multiple fields. So just as a brief explanation, a brief refresher here on what defaults are here. The field Z here within the definition A, what we're doing here is we're declaring it to be the field Z to have a default of 3 if no value is provided. Or alternatively, it just allows the user to provide a value, a concrete integer in this case here. So we can see A1 and A2 here being two, if you like, test cases for this, where for A1, there's no value of Z provided, so the default is selected, and A2, where Z is actually specified as a value. So here would be a better example where I've actually highlighted the default itself. So the challenge comes, though, when you have multiple fields and you want to default the Z field, if and only if X, Y, and Z are not set themselves. And this is quite surprisingly not a pattern we'd run into before until someone submitted some code to us which tried to effectively solve this, which highlighted a bug in version 0.4.3. So we'll come on to pass on thanks to that person in a minute. But just to show one potential way of actually doing this is via this sort of pattern here. And we'll link to the slides afterwards. Here, what we're actually doing is using a disjunction and an embedding. So notice within the yellow highlighted code there, the block that's being embedded, X and Y are both optional. So that says that if X is set, then it will be an error. And if Y is set, it will also be an error. That basically means that only in the situation where then Z is not set, will Z actually default to 3. And that works by virtue of the disjunction as well, because if, of course, that embedded block is in error in any way, it's eliminated, which just leaves the value of top. So this was a really, really nice pattern to have discovered. There's an alternative implementation here if B only contains X, Y, and Z. That's an alternative for actually implementing this pattern. And here are just a couple of tests that demonstrate this pattern actually working. We'll include some links. We'll link to this at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation, excuse me. So this fully working pattern will be in 0.5.0 beta 2, because there was another bug we discovered when we actually came to rely on this pattern. The history behind this is in issue 2139. Very big thanks to Matthias from Relic Solutions, who actually highlighted the bug and helped us arrive at this nice pattern. As I said, there's a playground link there for examples to the actual example itself. So now this brings us to the spotlight session, where I'm very pleased to welcome Joel Longtine and Sam Alba from the Dagger team. Joel and Sam, welcome.
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
No problem. I don't know whether you wanted to start by sort of telling us a bit about Dagger. If you want to share screen, or just shout and we can make that happen as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll probably do that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I've been in the Q community for, I think, 3+ years now. Started in 2019, middle of 2019, and I'm currently working at Dagger. Our previous version, 0.2, was completely configured with Q, and we're working on some additional new stuff with different languages. But yeah, let me give kind of just a brief overview of what Dagger is, and then we can kind of dive into some of the other pieces.
Sure.
So Dagger is basically a way to configure pipelines, CI pipelines, CD pipelines using code. Like I mentioned before, the initial version, the v0.2, was completely configured using Q, and we've expanded that to include other languages, Go, Python, Node.js, TypeScript, and I think there's a few other things that we're working on as well. And the back end is a GraphQL, and I can speak to that a little bit later. Yeah. So a few reasons you may want to use Dagger is we basically make it so that CI pipelines can be run anywhere. That could be locally, that could be in CI, etc. And they work the same way. We're using a technology that Docker built called BuildKit, which actually runs Docker build. Like when you run a Docker build in a recent version of Docker, it's using BuildKit to spin up containers, create file systems, Docker layers, all that stuff. And we're utilizing that as an execution engine behind the scenes for basically creating like hermetic, very cacheable CI pipelines. Yeah, is there anything else I should mention, Sam?
I think it's pretty exhaustive. If you have questions about anything, like, feel free to ask in the chat or live, and happy to answer them. It's maybe one small thing I would add is the reason why we built Dagger in the first place was to easily containerize CI/CD pipelines. And so a lot of people complained to us before Dagger existed about pipelines not to be reusable, not to work outside of the CI infrastructure. And so Dagger aims to make that super easy, where you don't see containers, you don't have to understand how to build your Docker files and how to containerize every part of your DAG. And instead, Dagger does this for you, and you just have to write code about what to do, what to build, how to run your test. And Dagger will take care of the rest, cache the content. So next time it runs, only the things that needs to be run will be executed. And also it will run exactly the same locally on your machine and on your CI infrastructure.
Nice. Joel, you said there was, is there anything you want to share your screen at any time if you wanted to? You talked about the different, do you call them SDKs that are ways of actually interfacing with Dagger these days in the 0.3?
Yeah, so we're building up an engine that is managed, or that you interact with GraphQL, but we have SDKs on top of that. Like I mentioned, Go, Python, Node.js, and I've been working on a port of our 0.2 API to that backend engine.
So that then becomes the Q SDK, does it? That would interface with the.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
It started basically as only Q. The first version of Dagger a year ago was supporting only Q, and that was the only language, the only interface that users had to define their pipeline.
Yep.
And I think about, I would say, over 6 months ago, we started to get the feedback from, there were some people really loved Q and they were really deep into it, and some other people were like, oh, actually, I would prefer another programming language. I mean, an actual programming language, not the config language for certain things. And so this is what basically drove us to rethink about the Dagger engine. And this is when we created this GraphQL backend and this SDK interface. And so now the Q support is indeed an SDK.
Yep.
So what Joel will be demoing is the current Q interface. So how to interact with Dagger using Q. And this SDK is aimed to evolve into another interface, because that right now we ported the interface that Dagger has been supported until today. And so we would like to make this this SDK a new basically a new one. Then there might be different ways to use Q, and so we're looking for feedback here. And so that's the reason why we wanted to demo that. So
that sounds good. I think there's actually going to be some interesting overlap with the function signature work that Aram talked about earlier on, actually, and how that potentially overlaps with Q interaction with your GraphQL based API. So Joel, over to you if you want to do a demo.
Yeah, looks like I'm not currently allowed to share my screen.
Okay, let me just fix that for you. Try again now.
Awesome. Cool. So let me just share. Yeah, I don't think that's. Yeah, I'll just share a kind of a smallish example of kind of what you can do with Q. And this is the the Q SDK. So basically, this is a Dagger plan in the Europa with the Europa.
Could you make it a little bit bigger, maybe?
Yeah, is that better?
Yep.
That good? Awesome. So this is just a few like simple steps. We could dive in deeper, but I also want to keep this relatively quick so we have time for additional stuff. But so this is like pulling the Alpine OCI image from like Docker Hub. This is pulling the 3.15 version. This is running the cat command inside of that container, and like just printing some environmental variables inside of those same containers. This is just like a relatively straightforward example of some of the kinds of things that you can do and sort of the interface that we have. So these are actually Qflow tasks. Core, pull, core.exec are both Q tasks so we're using ToolsFlow to actually run basically a DAG of these tasks inside of the ToolsFlow engine. And I guess I can show one other example quickly. This is a use case of taking like a Go application and doing a build of it. So I think this is the Go app. There's a main.go. There's some other stuff inside of it. It's pretty straightforward. And it's basically it's loading that into BuildKit. So it's taking that file system, putting it into BuildKit, and then we actually do a Go build on it, which this is a little complicated, so I won't dive too deep into it right at this moment. But it's basically just running a Go build, and then it's extracting the Go binary from that. Yeah, let's see where.
So it's fair to say, Joel, you Dagger were one of the folks who've had some troubles with the performance of ToolsFlow. And just to link that back to what we were focusing on for 0.6 is those performance issues, including those within ToolsFlow as well. So yeah, that's
it will get a lot faster.
yeah.
Yeah, especially for large configurations.
Yeah, large configurations, and you use ToolsFlow heavily, obviously, and disjunctions quite heavily as well. And it's the combination of those two which actually causes that performance to really blow up. So that hence the focus for 0.6.0, because you're not alone in actually running into that issue.
Yeah, and as you on the Q team are well aware too, the CloudFormation Q stuff should get a lot faster in that context, because that's something that I authored with a friend at a previous job, and yeah, it should be a lot faster in for those use cases as well. So I think where I'd like to go next is so this is kind of what I've been working on, basically taking all of the tasks that we built out for the v0.2 Dagger and porting them to the Go SDK. So previously Dagger was actually doing, the Dagger binary was actually doing all the interaction with BuildKit directly. And I basically worked on abstracting that out to use the Go SDK that we've built instead of doing those interactions with BuildKit directly. I've got a large portion of the tasks ported to the new engine. There's still a few things that are not working, but we're basically there. And so one of the curiosities that we at Dagger have is actually around like a native GraphQL Dagger QSDK. So I'm just going to show kind of some brief examples of what using the Go and the GraphQL SDK looks like, so we can talk about what a QS, so we can at least plant some seeds around what a potential QSDK that's native to the new APIs might look like. So this is this size okay?
Yep.
Cool. So
a little bit larger would help.
Joel, maybe if you made your screen slightly less tall, that might, or the window slightly less tall, that will that's perfect. That'll start to.
Awesome. So this is a pipeline written in Go, which uses the Go SDK to take some local Go code and generate a bunch of binaries for Linux, Darwin, AMD 64, and ARM 64. So you can see we're connecting to Dagger. We're loading in the current directory from the host. And then we're basically pulling the Golang latest container and mounting the source that we pulled in earlier. And then we're going and building all of those things, and we're actually exporting them back to the host. So we get a bunch of Go binaries at the end of this. So that's just kind of like a brief example of how you might write a bit of Dagger code with Go. And I want to show, so this is kind of a little bit of a sneak preview of some of the GraphQL backend stuff. We haven't officially released this as an SDK, but we're close to doing so.
Joel, could you just make this a bit bigger again? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
To explain the different things that you saw right there, because it's actually pretty dense in the sense that there are several layers in the engine now. Before it was just Q and BuildKit with the Golang Q API in between, and so now there is a GraphQL layer. And so what Joel just showed is now we have the same queue interface at the top that people can still use like before. Then we have, this is now implemented on using the Go SDK that you saw on the file before. So now people are using the Go SDK directly, or the queue interface, or actually the TypeScript, for instance, the TypeScript SDK. And actually both, every single SDK is generating GraphQL queries on the backend. So basically what you see right there on the screen is what the SDK generates, but what people can also write themselves if they want to, directly from any language. And that then talks to BuildKit to basically execute the pipeline.
So essentially,
Yes.
as I understand it, or let me just check I understand this, you're using GraphQL as your declarative engine input.
That's right. Yeah, because we think that it's a model that can allow you to do imperative things if you want to in your language. Like, let's say, for instance, you're using the Go SDK and you call to a remote API to do certain things before running your pipeline. So now you can. And so at some point in the chain, there is this declarative GraphQL API that basically provides everything in one to BuildKit through the Dagger engine. So yeah, this is the declarative API on the back end.
And sort of then, just so I'm getting this clear in my head, the SDKs are really then just different interfaces that spit out that declarative result, and that the engine executes that. So sort of it very similar, if you like, to the way that and other engines that have general purpose programming languages provides interfaces and things. Pulumi is a good example that comes to mind, I guess, in terms of how that works.
Yep. Yeah, and our SDKs are basically query builders.
Yeah.
So we're building up a GraphQL query that we've run in the background.
Yeah.
When various things happen, like asking for the contents of a file on a particular directory or something like that. So, yeah, there's some curiosity around like what a queue version of this would look like, how we could structure that. There's the data type side of things, more like schema-ish stuff that would be relatively straightforward, I'd say, for queue to do currently. And then there's more the query side of things, which is a little bit more uncertain, at least for me. But it sounds like maybe there's some potential with some of the WASM work that's occurring.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I look at this GraphQL on the left-hand side here, the thing that immediately jumps off the page is that it looks like function calls, for want of a better phrase, right, that are actually going on here. And so my mind is immediately taken to the work that Aram and Roger have been doing with the function signature work, which is effectively allows function signatures to be declared, for want of a better phrase, as types within the queue space, even though that's not, I don't think, quite precise, within the implementation of that function call being sort of handled as a separate concern that need not be part of the queue core built-ins, but it can be provided by some external source. Aram, Roger, I don't know whether you want to sort of chime in at this point here. Is it that sort of feels like at least the space in which thinking about how queue would map nicely onto this, or alternatively, right, is if for anybody else considering some sort of declarative sort of engine input with function signatures, things that sort of whole world has opened up quite a bit more than it is today.
Yeah, that meshes quite well with my way of thinking. The way I'm thinking about function signatures at the moment is that basically a function signature is a placeholder for a gateway to the outside world, essentially. So at the moment, the outside world that we've got is basically the standard library, which is always available and hermetic, but that might not be the case in the future. So your function, what looks like a function call, might be, a gateway to anything that potentially effectful in the outside world that could be addressed, that could be implemented by something external to queue in some fashion, maybe with WASM, maybe with something else.
I agree with Roger. I think this is definitely the direction where we want to go. So I think it's a good match there. I will just note that currently we've only been thinking of essentially pure functions and how they would work. Effectful functions are something that it's definitely something that we need to think more about, but we haven't really thought so much yet how that would work, because it's such a can of worms, and it requires so many decisions of how do you inject like the view of your universe, how do you restrict it. We need things like, we've been thinking of things like capabilities and other things, but nothing concrete yet. So it's definitely further down the line, but it's definitely the direction that we're trying to go to.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, some of the effectful functions reminds me of basically what we're doing with ToolsFlow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's the kind of place those could be put, just as a thought.
Yeah,
I think that's
the way.
Rog, go for it. I
Yes.
knew you were going to chime in here.
Yeah. Sorry. The way I've been thinking of it is that basically we might end up with function signatures being basically replacing ToolsFlow, and ToolsFlow being something that ends up going by the by, because you can do everything with function signatures that you could previously with ToolsFlow. That might not turn out to be the case, but that's the way I'm kind of thinking about it.
Cool.
So
that being said, there will always be a separation between like the pure and impure world. So you can always evaluate something in a pure context, so you know you're not going to have any side effects. So we want to preserve that property, regardless of how we're going to change things.
Very much.
So Joel, Sam, just taking the example here, if we squint at the GraphQL on the left-hand side here and imagine it was actually Q with function calls, what Roger's talking about there is a way of actually, quotes, running that queue or evaluating it in such a way that you provide the implementations of the function calls, so that you effectively get a callback, for want of a better phrase. And those callbacks happen, quotes, at the right time according to the dependency graph that is the queue evaluation, and it all then just happens. So I think that's where actually it would be interesting to sort of take what you have as the GraphQL here and sort of feed that in to, okay, well, this whole discussion about function signatures, WASM as being one sort of provider of those function implementation. But if you were using the Go API, at least I don't think it's too hard to imagine us actually saying, well, you can provide the implementation of the function in the actual Go binary that is running the evaluation itself, right? So that would be something that would be eminently doable as well. Steve, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering with those ideas about calling out functions, would we assume that referential transparency holds? In other words, would Q, or Ron, this is probably a question for you, would you try to avoid calling that function more than once and caching its value if it's the same expression? You know, say it appeared inside of a comprehension, which kind of looks like a loop. Wondering what the semantics would be of those call outs or those up calls to these functions.
It's a very good question, and we really have no good answer to it, except that by concentrating now only on pure functions, we kind of avoid the problem. So I don't know what the solution would be, but maybe I mean, it probably makes sense in comprehensions to only have pure functions, and that's why we have to have a type level separation or some way of separating pure computations from impure computations, so you can always statically enforce that you're only going to use pure functions. And what would happen with effectful functions, whether we cache results or not, it's again an open question, and I really don't know.
I mean, personally, my thought for effectful functions, one possible approach is actually to if you've got several calls, you can just unify the results, right? So if the function happens to return different things, then you end up with bottom, which is always a possible return.
So what I've seen with effectful functions, for example, timestamps. So if you have a function that will return the timestamp, then usually what you do in like systems like Q or previous configuration systems I've built is that within one context you have one answer, right? So you would have to unique it based on the input.
Yeah.
Joel, Sam, is there anything else that you want to talk about? I think that's a super interesting space, that whole GraphQL side of things there, but not least with the overlap with the function signature side of it. So I'm sure Aram and Roger would be happy to help as part of those discussions with also working out, okay, what would that actually look like from an API perspective?
Yeah, that'd be great. And thanks for inviting us and talk about what we're doing. It's great. And I think if anyone is interested to make the Q support evolve into Dagger, like that's really what we're looking for right now, to prioritize the work of this in between all the other SDKs. So that's really what we're looking for. If there is anything you want to dig into, we can be reached to our Discord server that you can find on the Docs website, or we also on the Slack Q community channel as well. Sam Alba and Joel as well.
Super.
So yeah, feel free to reach out to us, and thanks a lot.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to join and talk to us about Dagger. I guess folks can follow up offline, just sort of the interest of time. We'll move on now. Just to talk briefly about future calls. January 2023 will be the next community call, where we'll have another spotlight. As I said, we will do this at a time that is much more friendly to FOG and folks on the Kubevela team, at least, who are ahead of us in time zones. We'll announce this via the community shared calendar, but we'll also post on Twitter and via the announce issue as well. The next docs and content call, Carmen, do you want to talk briefly about that?
Sure. It will be postponed to January. The December date that was set is actually at the very same date and time as the QCon Plus event, for which Marcel will be giving his virtual, it's pre-recorded, but I have to host that. And so we are getting later into the holidays. And so it's just best to maybe meet up again and start sometime in the new year. We will let you know, and we will post that in the announcement issue and in the community calendar.
Super, thank you. I'll very briefly introduce, this is another thing we thought would be quite fun to do as a bit of a brain teaser for folks. With thanks to George Hader and Ashley Jesser on the Benthos project, Benthos actually provide a Q adapter for providing configuration to Benthos in Q, and George worked on that. But Benthos, another key part of Benthos is that they also do data transformations or mappings. And in those conversations with Ashley, what we did was, we said, well, please, can you share with us the gnarliest of data transformations that you actually have to perform? Because data transformation is something that feels like would be really appropriate for Q. There's obviously a lot of detail behind whether that would work at scale, etc. But it feels like something that is very naturally expressed in Q. And so if you head over to Q discussion 2158, you can see the problem specification there and have a bit of fun at posting your solutions to that, with perhaps thinking about, well, what is the nicest solution in terms of, is it the easiest to read? And using that as perhaps sort of a reflection on, well, in what ways could Q be improved here? Sort of perhaps thinking about the query proposal, for those who might want to go and take a look at that discussion. So please, this is like a bit of fun. There's nothing serious about it. Don't scroll too far down if you want to avoid spoilers. Just stay at the top where the issue discussion itself. The description at the top is long enough to avoid spoilers appearing on the first screen. So yeah, have a bit of fun with that. As always, if there's any feedback, things that you'd like to see more of, less of, or where you'd like us to focus on things, please let us know via any of the usual channels. Otherwise, we will pass over to Q&A if anybody has got anything they would like to bring up. Fog, hello.
Hi, so we have discussed about the ability to set value before, unlike the field value. So will this capability be added to the version 0.6?
That is a very good question, Fog. That's actually something we should, so just to fill everybody else in on the conversation here, Kubevela have, as part of their project, they have a situation where they actually want to patch a value, and patch is a bit of an overloaded term in this situation. If you're using, so as Kubevela do, they use the Go API. What that allows you to do is call a function that is fill path. Actually, let me just share my screen. No, I won't share my screen. That'll be tricky. That will go badly wrong. Allows you to fill path, which effectively unifies a value at a given path. What the Kubevela project need to do in a certain situation is actually override a value. Now, that means a lot of different things in different situations. And even though this sort of feels a bit antithetical to what Q actually is all about, there are scenarios where people do need to patch values. And if you're doing something with the Go API, you're fairly much more in control of things. You can run the evaluator multiple times, you can deal with a workflow that is very clearly stated as being a patch workflow. So Fog, we don't have a plan yet to include that in v0.6.0, but we absolutely can. And I think the takeaway is for me to actually publish an issue that includes that write-up of the Google Doc that we shared. So I'd suggest we have that as the next step. I think there's two versions of the implementation there, as we talked about. One is a more simple one. So that more simple one, I think, is the one that you actually needed, and that we could potentially consider including in 0.6.0.
Cool, thank you.
Great. Well, we'll have that as a takeaway. Thanks for reminding me on that. Steve.
I remember seeing something surfaced in the playground build of Q, where when you typed the literal for bottom, over on the right side, it would say something like error bottom forbidden in source, or something to that effect, hinting, finger wagging at you. What are you doing? And I'm wondering, as the built-in functions arrive, maybe in version 6, will we forbid use of the bottom literal in more context? Will Q6 try to guess at how to fix them? I'm wondering where we'll go from there.
Well, the idea is to ultimately get rid of the bottom symbol, I think, because it's kind of nasty, but it will usually will keep old syntax around for a very long time, right? And then it's not really in the way, unlike, for example, the regular expression symbol, right? Which is a little bit annoying with the equals and then space equals, right? Like if you do it in pattern constraints. So there we could say we just use, tilde, and then you would have to get rid of the old token eventually. But bottom isn't really in the way anywhere, right? So we could just keep it around, but it doesn't read very well in general. Plus, the thing where it's used most for is actual comparison against bottom. And people really mean very different things about it. So if you look at the implementation, it's something rather unprincipled but very practical. But really, what we have is 3 different interpretations of it, right? So really, so is valid, is defined, or is concrete, right? Like those are really the 3 things that people want to know. So it's much nicer to just use one of these 3 built-ins to actually sort of identify what does the user really want to test with this, right? And get rid of bottom, but we won't really get rid of it.
Also, the error built in as well, just to flag that, and that's something that the policy folks would be keen on. Is where you actually want to say, well, if effective, this field should be in error under this condition, then having the error built in, where you can perhaps then provide an error message as the argument to that has some fairly attractive properties for folks who, in the policy world, it's then a very specific error that can be lifted and presented to the end user in that scenario.
The idea is you would use this in a disjunction, and if the disjunction fails, it will notice there's this error in the disjunction and would service that error message.
Yeah, Roger's just posted an example that it is to the discussion there.
I think JSON users are used to that, where it's frequently a default value. In other words, there's an error function that you set as a default often, and then if it's not overridden, it surfaces as it fails to evaluate. That makes sense to me. Just real quickly, you mentioned is defined as one of the 3 cases people use bottom for. Is it correct that that's how you detect whether a hidden field is populated in some way?
Yeah, that would be one way. So is defined wouldn't check like is the value an error, right? It would just check like is it specified by the user. Whereas is valid would really recursively validate, like, is it a valid value? And is concrete would then also check, is it concrete? Not recursively, right? So they're really mutually exclusive, these three.
I think it's issue 943, Steve, where we can. There's super happy to pick up conversation in there, because that's where it actually talks about those proposed built-ins. If there's, because I know we've had a number of backwards and forwards, great discussion on Slack about, okay, how should this queue look like where we're comparing against bottom right now. So I think to take your specific example over to 943 would really help to flesh it out and make it a bit more concrete.
Although the design has changed a little bit, right? Like what we're thinking of now. So there's this num-defined built-in where you can give it like a constraint on the number, and then you count how many fields are defined. So that would be much better, a much cleaner way to write one-off protobufs, for example. Much more powerful also and cleaner. But now what we're thinking of is to have num-defined instead return a number. So you would have to do must num-defined equals 0 or something like that, and it allows you to use num-defined itself in comprehensions, right, like in if statements. So makes it a little bit more usable.
Cool. I think we may be done at that, and apologies, we've run over by 15 minutes today, so thank you to those who stayed around. We'll make the recording available afterwards, as we do always, and we'll share links to the slides for those who didn't get the link to the brain teaser this time around. Joel, thank you to you and Sam for your time joining us, and wishing everybody happy Christmas/holiday season, and seeing everybody in the new year.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
See you next time.
See ya.